So this helps to rescue Angela Davis, just like it helps to rescue Scottsboro 9. And of course, as I note, Huey Newton was a devotee of Castro and Robeson.
The figure of Eldridge Cleaver.
It
Troubled character, perhaps a troubling character very often.
was on the bestseller list with his book Soul on Ice, as well as the FBI's most wanted list. It becomes difficult for the Panthers because they had sought to burn bridges. The Panthers could have learned from the Communist Party. The Communist Party could have learned from the Panthers, or at least Newton, with regard to the struggle against homophobia. The star of the Paris Olympics is implicated in this. Speaking of Snoop Dogg, let me say this tongue in cheek so people don't get the wrong idea. I'm not as young as I look.
He ends up being a, quote, sexy pants designer. And that is a detail that I think maybe is worthy of some commentary.
We win, you lose.
Shall we begin?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So hello, everyone. I'm Anthony Ballas. This is De Facto Podcast. This is episode 15. And I'm once again joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And today, long awaited, we're going to be talking about his newest book, Armed Struggle, ? Panthers and Communists, Black Nationals, and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s, which was published around a month ago or so by international publishers. Dr. Horne, thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
So this is a sprawling history about the lead up and the formation of the Black Panther Party in the era just after the Smith Act trials and the so-called Red Scare of the 1940s and 50s, the era of the Civil Rights Movement, the Watts Uprising, which you also have written about, and the flourishing of Black nationalism in Southern California, as well as the NAACP post-compromise of 1954, which I would like to talk to you about. The book is also very much about the political and ideological makeup of Southern California historically, leading up to the 1960s and 70s, and its unique role in fomenting various forms of radicalism throughout the decades. So my first question for you is a broad one, Dr. Horne. Why did you select this history in particular to focus on and analyze in 2024?
Well, the immediate trigger is this. I do these interviews for the Pacifica station in Los Angeles, kpfk.org. And some years back, I was interviewing Curtis Austin, who specializes in the history of the Panthers. His next book, for example, deals with the San Francisco Panthers. And he had mentioned that despite its importance, there hadn't been any accounting of the Panthers in the Southland, in Southern California. So that's how I stumbled upon the topic, was through that interview with Curtis Austin. And then, secondly, I have this tributary of scholarship dealing with Southern California. As you mentioned, I did a book on the Watts Uprising. I've done 2 books on Hollywood, Southern California. My book on the Mexican Revolution implicates the Southland. I used to teach in Santa Barbara. At the same time, I was living part-time in Los Angeles. As noted, I do these interviews for the Pacifica station in Los Angeles. I used to write periodically for the LA Times when I was in Santa Barbara. And that triggered something in my mind, because what I wrote for the LA Times, and this is years ago, it wasn't necessarily watered down. I mean, and that made me begin to think about politics in Southern California and about the nature of Southern California, because for various reasons, I could not and would not have been allowed to write what I was writing for the LA Times for their peer competitors, speaking of Washington Post and the New York Times, for example. So all of that congealed in this current project. And then to go on, inevitably, this project is based upon previous work. What I mean by that is a sub-theme of this book deals with the question of settler colonialism. It deals with the question of enslavement and its legacy, which helps to explain why certain Black people found it necessary to pick up the gun at a certain point. This is a book that deals with global solidarity, which has been a repetitive theme I've pursued with regard to Mexican Revolution, with regard to Southern Africa, the Caribbean, socialist camp, even British abolitionism, Mexico's assistance to the enslaved. Oops, sorry about that. Me. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Couldn't hear it actually.
Oh, okay, good. Oh, okay. And so all of these forces and elements combine to propel this current project.
Mm-hmm. Now, since you're talking about some of the work that you've already done, that intersects in this project or dovetails in this project, you've done work on the Scottsboro Nine, for instance.
Mhm.
William Patterson, who is throughout this book makes many appearances. Of course, your book on the Watts Uprising, and your book on the Mexican Revolution, and so on. And it's interesting, and we should probably talk about why your book starts in 1850 when you're talking about the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s.
Well, I started in 1850 because I'm trying to establish a point about the violence of the Southland, the violence of Southern California. And circa 1850 is when you have the US takeover from Mexico. The historian Benjamin Matley, in his book on Native Americans in California, suggests that one of the most significant genocides against the indigenous population takes place precisely in California. Now, as a person who's written about 19th century Texas, I do not accept that point easily, but I do accept the point that you cannot begin to understand the terror inflicted by the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, the rather routine terror that's inflicted upon Black people without understanding the preceding decades of bloodshed targeting the indigenous population, which helps to create this culture of violence. And the culture of violence not only includes what the authorities are perpetrating, it also includes what the so-called Euro-American civilian population is inflicting. For example, there really needs to be a study of arson and perpetrated against Black people. Of course, I have a number of incidents with regard to arson in the Southland. I guess, to use it euphemistically, it's an aggressive form of gentrification where you just burn people out. You go to work in the morning, you come back, and your home is a heap of ashes. By the way, I don't think that book would be that hard to do. Just parenthetically, you have a number of specialists on fire. Stephen Pyne, Pyne, who's in Arizona. I interviewed Daniel Immerwahr of Northwestern a few weeks ago, and you can find that online, who's studying arson perpetrated by the enslaved against enslavers, including attempts to immolate the widow of George Washington, Senator John C. Calhoun, Marks of the Master Class, what's called, the senator from South Carolina during the antebellum period, the attempt to torch the Confederate White House, for example, with the perpetrators escaping. So I begin the book in short and in sum in 1850 because I'm trying to establish this culture of violence, but not only a culture of violence, but a culture of misdeeds. And I use that category to underscore what's happening, for example, when Black people are migrating out west as World War II is heating up. and they're taking the bus, and then you'd have a bus stop for people to refresh themselves, and then the bus driver would drive off and leave the people stranded without any place to live, etc. It's just sort of routine, a misrule and misdeeds. And so I saw painting that picture as a prelude and a precursor to understanding the rise of radicalism in response, the rise of the Black Panther Party in particular.
You also thread this history of the formation of Black Panther Party, kind of some of the historical circumstances that really paved the way or set the stage for the rise of the Black Panthers by threading your analysis through the Smith Act trials and this period, 1940s and 1950s, that you've written extensively on. Did you want to talk a little bit about that, how that set the stage for the rise of the Panthers?
Well, sure. I mean, the Southern California Communist Party was one of the stronger affiliates in that organization, running more candidates for office, with candidates receiving thousands and thousands of votes before the Smith Act trials of 1951, 1952. And then after there's a kind of political thaw, resuming in the 1960s, getting thousands and thousands of votes running for people and candidates for office. The Smith Act trials were ostensibly targeting exclusively the Communist Party, but of course the ripple effects were widespread because it helped to demonize the entire socialist project. There was a neat formula that was applied then, which is that ML equals FV. Marxism-Leninism equals force and violence. And that was the ostensible basis for the trials. That is to say that the comrades were seeking to overthrow the United States government by force of arms. And now, as I point out, the jury was out longer for the Los Angeles Smith Act trial than for analogous trials, because of course there were Smith Act trials from the Atlantic to the Pacific, including in Honolulu, which I talk about in my book, Fighting in Paradise, about the left in Hawaii before statehood, 1959. And one of the points I'm trying to make in the introduction in particular is that I think that the left needs to take account of the fact that there is a federal system in the United States, which after all is enforced by the Electoral College, which turns a presidential election into 50 plus different elections. And therefore you can win the most votes overall and still lose, as Hillary Rodham Clinton could inform you. And that makes it possible for the political culture of Texas, where I'm now sitting, to not necessarily be the same as the political culture of Southern California, for example. And it helps to explain why the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, is a former Cuba Solidarity activist in her youth, whereas the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, is a former cop, police officer. And so one of the political messages I'm trying to convey to our friends and comrades on the left is to take into account the federal system of the United States when devising strategy and tactics. I know that there's a felt need by some to homogenize strategy and tactics and to make sure we're all on the same page with regard to a presidential election. But in Texas, where the Republicans have a stranglehold and have dominated every statewide office for decades, to suggest that California should, where the Republicans are on life support, at least statewide in Sacramento, that they should pursue the same strategy as Texas. I mean, just to have everybody on the same page, it doesn't make any sense to me. Mm-hmm. And I think it leads to splits and purges because people are wondering, even in California, for example, a sub-theme of this book is how, based upon settlement, there had been a domination of San Francisco over the entire state, even as Los Angeles was outstripping the North in population. You still see that in California. I mean, most of the leading politicians from the Golden State, including Vice President Harris, come from the fog-bound city. The governor, Gavin Newsom, former speaker, Nancy Pelosi, etc. And so that was a point of contention, even within the Communist Party. That is to say, why are all these people from San Francisco running everything when the funds and the population are in the Southland? And speaking of the funds, of course, a lot of the funding for the Communist Party and the left and the Panthers is coming from Hollywood, which is a sub-theme of this book. It's a theme explored in my two previous books on Hollywood, for example. So once again, this book is the equivalent of the old Russian dolls, where you pull out one doll and another doll. Well, I mean, this book is one of the Russian dolls, and there are other dolls, including books on Hollywood,
Right.
slavery, books on settler colonialism. They're all interconnected.
Yeah, I really like how you characterize that. And some of those details are striking, especially if some of our listeners or viewers have read some of these other books. Marlon Brando, Dalton Trumbo, etc., helping fund the Panthers and supporting them. That has to do with the Southlands and this, I think you call it a virtuous circle, celebrity that is erected to try to contain some of the more violent attacks on the Panthers and so on. It's a quite interesting analysis. Now, you just mentioned in your introduction a little bit, but one of the more striking details of your introduction that I think many of the readers of this book will probably note are the autobiographical details that you provide about your time in Berkeley when you were a law student. I think it might be interesting for some of our viewers to hear about some of these details. Can you talk a little bit about your time in Berkeley interfacing with the Panthers, some of whom you knew and corresponded with and participated in the politics and so on?
Well, I mean, let me say this tongue in cheek so people don't get the wrong idea that I'm not as young as I look. And I first visited Oakland, Berkeley in 1969 for a Panther conference on anti-fascism, which was really in some ways a high point of their existence, insofar as they were bringing together the entire U.S. left on this platform of anti-fascism. And they were in league with the Communist Party. Herbert Aptheker, the communist historian, gave one of the leading addresses at that time. There were international visitors from Japan and elsewhere. And that was a prelude to my arriving to live in San Francisco in June 1970, as I began to matriculate at the University of California at Berkeley as a law student, in which point I became involved with the Panthers, teaching at Vacaville Prison, just north of Berkeley, where one of my students, then known as Donald DeFries, who I lent my copy of Ingalls, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, emblematic of how I was being shaped and influenced at that time, which he never returned, not least because after being freed, he went up in flames, literally, as a result of a shootout with the LAPD. He was affiliated with the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army, which was accused of kidnapping newspaper heiress Patty Hearst. You can still find online some of the video of Patty Hearst with SLA comrades involved in bank heists. Of course, it was later charged that she was brainwashed. She was eventually pardoned. I begin the book by quoting letters from Erica Huggins, one of the Panther leaders, that dealt with some of my political activity working with the Berkeley City Council. At that time, in 72, I was at the celebration after the exoneration of Angela Davis, charged with capital crimes as a result of a shootout at the Marin County Courthouse in August 1970. A few months after I'd moved to the Bay Area, I was living in San Francisco at that time. And then, of course, I had interaction with a number of Communist Party leaders who I've mentioned throughout. Angela's lawyer, Doris Walker, I worked with her in the National Lawyers Guild, with which I was affiliated for some time. So I could go on in this vein, but I think what it illustrates is that in addition to being a product of research, this book also reflects some of my recollections, some of my personal memories, for example. And so to an extent, it has a sort of a memoir-like cast.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, that's very interesting. Another component of this book is a very long discussion, multi-chapter discussion of the figure of Eldridge Cleaver, who is a troubled character, perhaps a troubling character very often. Several of your inferences regarding the missteps of the Black Panther Party can be found in your analysis of Cleaver, including what you call his trademark ultra-leftism,
Mm-hmm.
championing of the Lumpen,
Mm-hmm.
ideological inconsistency, and many more seedy details. So I have a couple of questions about Cleaver. Kind of want you to talk a little bit about your analysis of Cleaver and why his leadership in the party was perhaps at best complicated or complicating, and at worst, a serious detriment for the party. That's one.
So Cleaver becomes one of my characters because the book is about the Southland. And so he grew up in Watson, Pasadena, just like two of my other characters, Jonathan Jackson, who leads the action at the courthouse, grows up in Pasadena, as does his older brother, George Jackson. Angela Davis matriculates at UC San Diego. She's one of my characters and then teaches at UCLA. So geography, to a certain extent, explains my focus on Cleaver, because I'm trying to be true to the title, in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, is the fact that during the period in which he becomes prominent in the Panthers, the other top leaders, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, are in and out of prison. And then another factor is that by establishing the international legation of the Panthers in Algiers, North Africa, that was a very significant and substantive breakthrough. Ditto for his establishing fraternal relations in Africa with the nation then known as the People's Republic of the Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, to be distinguished from the larger Congo across the Congo River, Kinshasa. The smaller Congo, of course, tried to adopt, before the collapse of the socialist count, a socialist project, and then reached out to Black Americans as a result. The legation in Algiers had fraternal relations with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Cleaver led delegations to Soviet Union, North Korea, China, Vietnam. He was trying to suggest that Black soldiers in Vietnam turn the guns around and begin to attack their officers rather than attacking the Vietnamese. Cleaver was one of the few people who was on the bestseller list with his book Soul on Ice, as well as the FBI's most wanted list. A very unique posturing, if you like. But at the same time, Cleaver was a self-admitted rapist, a homophobe, a spouse batterer, insanely jealous to the point of volcanic proportions, up to and including being credibly accused of killing a comrade who had the gumption to have an affair with his spouse, even though he was having affairs all the time, needless to say. Cleaver was a bundle of contradictions. And then, of course, he sort of paints himself into a corner with his ultra-leftism, for example. And as so often happens with ultra-leftism, he moves to the right, becomes a conservative Christian, reputedly joins the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, apparently cooperates with the U.S. authorities. One of his attorneys, when he's trying to make his way back to the United States, is the stepfather of Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Samuel Pisar, who happened to be a leading Zionist. And by the way, even during the time when Cleaver was styling himself as being radical and progressive, he had this fascination with Zionism. I mean, like many prisoners during that era, at least, he read quite a bit, like many prisoners. And as I say, from time to time, he's influenced by both Marx and Machiavelli, perhaps Machiavelli more than Marx.
Yeah.
And he's influenced by Frantz Fanon, for example, the Martinican, who dedicates himself to the Algerian Revolution, the author of numerous books, and the subject of a number of recent biographies too, by the way. And a decided influence on the Panthers. You'll encounter from time to time, in fact, Black men, probably in their 40s and 50s now, who carry the name Fanon. Just like you'll find Black men of us in that age group carrying the name Malcolm, for example. Or Mandela Barnes, who was the Democratic Party candidate for Senate a year or two ago in the state of Wisconsin. So Cleaver is a very complicated figure. Fortunately, also, this helps to shape history, or the writing of history. There's quite a bit of material about him. He left an archive at UC Berkeley. There's another archive at Texas A&M in College Station, Texas. A lot of the correspondence that he wrote while he was behind bars can still be accessed. His paramour, who helped to spring him from prison, the attorney Beverly Axelrod, she left an archive at the University of Delaware, for example. She would be worthy of a biographical treatment too, by the way, for various reasons. And so the archive sort of leads the writer, who already is focusing on the Southland and focusing on the Panthers, to focus on Cleaver. Now, I would say the same thing for Angela Davis, because she has an archive at Harvard. That's where the main archive is. But there are all sorts of other archives. There's an archive at this independent Marxist library in Oakland, the Nebo Proctor Library. There are the trial records from her trial that they're everywhere because they're on microfilm. There are the records at UC San Diego, where she was a graduate student, the records at UCLA, where she was an assistant professor. And so that archive helps to lead one to write about her as well.
I don't want to change the subject away from Angela Davis, but I do have one other question about Cleaver, because you do a very interesting rendition of this character growing up in the Southlands, going to prison, reading extensively, becoming enthralled with the Nation of Islam, and then turning his back, embracing Marx, and kind of turning his back, vacillating between ideological formations and so on. And that helps to explain his role and his leadership role that he takes, and some of the problems associated with his presence in a leadership role in the party. But what it doesn't explain maybe readily is how when he returns from exile and comes clawing back to the United States, as you put it, he ends up being a quote sexy pants designer, and that is a detail that I think maybe is worthy of some commentary.
So Cleaver was a dabbler. He dabbled in music. He dabbled in screenplays. He dabbled in writing about himself, the best-selling Soul on Ice. And when he designed these pans, which featured a cod piece, which is an attachment to the pants that accentuates the male genitals, so to speak. He was the model in the advertisements for these pants, in fact. I guess he thought that given the times, the sexual revolution, the toxic masculinity, to coin a phrase, that these sexy men's pants would find an audience of consumers. But perhaps because of poor capitalization, poor marketing, they did not. And so he had to turn to other avenues.
And instead of receiving capital from this venture of his, he received a pie in the face, if I'm not mistaken,
Right.
when he was in Canada.
Right.
So on a more serious kind of theoretical note, though, your critique of the Lumpen element in the Black Panther Party, having to do both with Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton, is quite interesting. And you talk about these lasting effects that this embrace of the Lumpen kind of had, rippling out into even our contemporary day. For instance, you talk about this word pimpin', which functions as a noun, a verb, and an adjective simultaneously, which I found very interesting because it highlights not only how this word has become ubiquitous, but also normalized in our lexicon, in popular culture and outside. And I wanted to know why today you think we should be suspicious of this Lumpen element, and what's your analysis of this element in contemporary politics?
Well, number one, the Lumpen element comes from Marx, the 18th Brumaire. And I have an essay on the Lumpen, which you can find online, or if you are so inclined, you can purchase the Reader, I dare say, where the essay about the Lumpen that I wrote some years ago is reprinted, where I do a historical analysis of that concept. With regard to the Black Panther Party, I think that they conflated the Lumpen, which roughly and loosely could be equated with larcenists, pimps, drug dealers, but they did not necessarily draw critical distinctions between and amongst the big Lumpen, for example, organized crime families, and the little petty Lumpen, some minor drug dealer, for example. Plus, they conflated what could be called the Industrial Reserve Army of Labor, the unemployed, with the Lumpen, which is a theoretical blunder in my estimation. And also, as Roscoe Proctor, who was a Black communist leader with a stevedore background, pointed out, who had been based in both Southland and Northern California, that they're alighting on this concept of the Lumpen as being sort of the locomotive of revolutionary transformation has something to do with a general apprehension in the Black community, including the Panthers, about the wherewithal of the working class, the overall working class. And then, as I said, this book, in some ways, is based upon previous books. And you may have noticed I repetitively quote my book on the 16th century, although this book deals heavily with the second half of the 20th century. And I do that because what I'm trying to point out is that settler colonialism which is, that term has barged its way into our vocabulary as a result of heroic student protesters focusing on settler colonialism in historic Palestine, and inevitably the telescope has been pointed back across the Atlantic in this direction. Settler colonialism, as I point out in my 16th century book and thereafter, and heavily involves class collaboration. That's an explanation for January 6, 2021, CEOs flying in on private planes, shopkeepers, military veterans with a working class background, D-class elements, joining together to prevent the peaceful transfer of power from one wing of the bourgeoisie to another wing. It explains why David Duke, a Klansman and Nazi in 1991, received 55% of the Euro-American vote across class lines in his race for governor of the Pelican State, Louisiana. Class collaboration explains quite a bit, just like class struggle explains quite a bit. That explosive descriptor was in the title of my first Hollywood book, so obviously it's a phenomenon that I'm well acquainted with. But also, I think it helps to shed light on some of these so-called racial differences. Because as I point out, the unpaid sector of the working class, which is another way to describe the enslaved population, class struggle inheres in the unpaid sector of the working class. It's epitomized by the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which is a transformational event in terms of struggle, setting the stage for the rise of unions, setting the stage for the socialist project. And so, referencing the previous point, you have the descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class who were more prone to vote against the right, but then were forced into this Faustian bargain that I talk about, the Compromise of 1954, whereby in return for throwing overboard internationalism having been our saving grace, we are rescued to a degree from the ravages of Jim Crow. But then again, this is a quote unquote that comes with a heavy price tag. That is to say, the ditching of consistent internationalism. So all of that helps to shed light on why the Panthers, including Cleaver and not excluding others, affix themselves to this concept of the Lumpen. And interestingly enough, this concept of the Lumpin also has had impact on popular culture. I talk about that in the article aforementioned that I wrote in terms of so-called gangster rap, in terms of the proliferation of this term pimping, and of course the the star of the Paris Olympics is implicated in this. Speaking of Snoop Dogg,
Oh, right, right.
for example, you might want to put his name in a search engine with the term pimp and pimpin', for example. But you just can't affix this to one person. I mean, it's a political phenomenon, it's a cultural phenomenon, it's a widespread phenomenon. And of course, it's a Hollywood phenomenon too, because I think in that article, I mentioned that one of the reasons why there is a genre in Hollywood of gangster movies, some of their most sterling creations, including Godfather 1, 2, and 3, a lot of these Martin Scorsese flicks. I think it's called State of Grace with Sean Penn. It deals with the Irish mafia. You have all of these organized crime films, some of which are very interesting, coming out of Hollywood. And as I think I said in that article, that it speaks the fact that gangsters are heavily involved in the rise of Hollywood. For example, if professors had been heavily involved in the rise of Hollywood, you'd have probably more films heroizing professors, for example. So, and then of course, as I point out, there's a lot of Hollywood influence On the Panthers, I mentioned that at one time they're polemicizing against the so-called black exploitation trend in Hollywood, because you have this explosion of films dealing with pimps, gangsters, like Superfly, for example, with Ron O'Neal.
Or Sweet Sweetback, which you
Sweet,
talk
sweet. I
about.
remember Superfly because the leading character, he wore this big hat.
Right.
Then he had his hair was straightened, so it draped down to his shoulders. So you had a lot of Negroes. They began to buy these hats with hair draping down to their shoulders, like the character in Superfly. And so
That reminds me, so I don't know, but that's the seems to be what Cat Williams was going for early in his career,
right,
right?
right,
Like sort of image inherited from the 1970s or so.
right. And then, but then finally, as I talk about in the book, the Mac, which is part of that genre, the Mac being another euphemism for the pimp.
Mm-hmm.
It's filmed in Oakland. And so the Panthers decide, hey, wait a minute, you should hire some of our comrades to be extras in this film. And I think they work out a deal, but then they wind up being underpaid.
Right.
So it's difficult to separate this conflicted era, interestingly enough, from theorizing about class, uh, theorizing about the Lumpen, historicizing the Lumpin, etc.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I always love hearing what you have to say about this Lumpen element because it's often the kind of a missing link in certain arguments. Let me give an example. In film studies, for instance, it's well understood genre-wise that the gangster film is kind of an inversion of the Western, it's turning it on its head. But the missing link is that, well, in the Wild West and in the sort of mafia, big lumpen culture, both are share the legacy of class collaboration in the United States, as you detail in your book on Texas, for instance. And so that shared lineage is already there, sort of organic to both of those genres, but no one's really analyzed that element. So it's very intriguing for me in particular to hear what you have to say about that. Um, so another critique you have of the Black Panther Party is their embrace of Maoism and what you call the faulty bet on China over the Soviet Union and Cuba. You also critique the Communist Party's paeans of praise for slaveholding founders such as Jefferson, which made it problematic for militant Black youth to accept its more sage counsel. I'm very interested to hear more about these critiques of the Communist Party and the Black Panthers, and sort of, you talk about this factionalism that occurred between Newton and Cleaver, of course, but there's this global picture, sort of the internationalism that you already talked about in terms of Cleaver and Algeria, right? But seems to be an imperfect internationalism, and so there were some missteps in the global scene. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I should also add to that litany the question of homophobia, because
Right.
Part of the story that I tell is a story about the rise of the gay rights movement, the queer rights movement, and how at least Newton, was favorable to this movement. And when Bobby Seale ran for mayor of Oakland some decades ago, he was the chair of the party. They made pointed appeals to this movement. After all, they're in San Francisco Bay Area.
Right.
In some ways, the citadel of this movement. And if it's not the citadel of this movement, perhaps the Southland could be considered that. After all, Harry Hay, considered to be a founder of this movement, had roots in the Southland. His papers, by the way, are at the San Francisco Public Library. I quote them extensively. They're very useful to go through. And I think that, as I said, I think just as the Panthers could have learned from the Communist Party with regard to the international situation, Communist Party could have learned from the Panthers, or at least Newton, with regard to the struggle against homophobia, because the Communist Party was busily purging queer rights activists. Although, as I try to point out, there are certain reasons other than homophobia that might shed light on that that I discuss in the book. And with regard to internationalism, oh, and I should also mention that Cleaver was not part of that. He was a unalloyed homophobe, put it mildly. Although his biographer says that he was a latent homosexual, so go figure.
Right.
In any case, latent homosexual is the biographer's term, not mine. In any case, with regard to internationalism, the Panthers at one time were very close to the Communist Party, very close to William Patterson, a Black communist leader who was born in San Francisco, who was a direct influence on Paul Robeson, a leader of the movement to free Angela Davis, an influence on the West Coast Longshore. By the way, once again, in terms of federalism, West Coast Longshore was influenced by the Communist Party, East Coast Longshore influenced by gangsters. Consult the book by Howard Kimmeldorf, Reds or Rackets, or Screen on the Waterfront, for example, with Marlon Brando. So what's interesting is that at a certain point, particularly after Nixon and Kissinger go to China, there's this breakthrough in Washington's relations with China on an anti-Soviet basis. There were many people who were unconvinced that that was the nature of the alliance. They continued to see Washington and Moscow conspiring against so-called colored China. And I think that that was due to a number of reasons. One, it was a throwback, perhaps, to the pre-1945 era, when Japan was styling itself as the champion of the so-called colored races. That was reflected in my book, Facing the Rising Sun, the book Race War, which influenced a number of Black nationalists, including some today who still invoke the term Asiatic Black man, although I'm not sure if they realize where that comes from. Mm-hmm. And I understand Wu-Tang Clan, for example, is still invoking the term Asiatic Black man. And that comes from that pro-Tokyo Black nationalism. And so I think many of the Panthers thought that they were about to embark on a replay of that. And then it's the Black nationalism per se, because the Panthers in some way were a halfway house between Black nationalism and socialism, a sort of halfway house between Islam inflected by Black nationalism and socialism. Many of the Panthers, such as Cleaver, come out of the Nation of Islam, for example, before migrating to the Panthers and their socialist orientation. And of course, as I note, Huey Newton, the founder, was a devotee of Castro and Robeson. He was influenced by Patterson and the Civil Rights Congress, which was led by Patterson, which was a movement against racist and political repression, which had strengthened the San Francisco Bay Area. And so those factors also contribute to another point, which is that I think distinguishing themselves from the Communist Party helps to answer the question, why don't they just join the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party or form another Che Lumumba Club, which of course helped to attract Angela Davis, which is sort of an all-Black formation within the Communist Party. And so that too, I think, contributes to their distancing themselves from the Communist Party. And then, of course, there are basic issues of ideology concerning the working class and Lumpin, for example. And so all of that leads to their Maoism. The problem is that I think that alienates them from a nation that will be important if there are those who want to escalate what could become an anti-fascist struggle in the 21st century. I'm speaking of Cuba, since Cuba was heavily dependent upon the Soviet Union, and the Panthers were readily denouncing the Soviet Union. But it wasn't just that as well. I mean, the Panthers made errors with regard to India, a close ally, then as now, to Moscow, when Bangladesh, now in the news, broke away from Pakistan, assisted by India, by the way. The Panthers were dismissive, which of course accorded with the China-Pakistan alliance, but did not necessarily win the plaudits in what is now the largest country on earth, speaking of India, then the second largest. They made mistakes with regard to Guyana, country with which I'm well familiar, having traveled there a number of times and actually being present during the trial of Walter Rodney before he was assassinated, which has a mixture of African and South Asian descent population. And once again, not just the Panthers, many influenced by Black nationalism, they latched on to Forbes Burma, who was African, who they saw in a sort of so-called racial struggle with the South Asians, even though the South Asian community was heavily influenced by Chetty Jagan, who had faced destabilization by the US CIA, which he wrote about quite a bit. His spouse, Janet Jagan, of course, was a Jewish American who Chetty met in Chicago when he was matriculating at Northwestern. That did not win them many plaudits in the Caribbean, where there was a much more nuanced understanding of Guyana. Recall that this was a time when Michael Manley and his social democratic forces were surging to prominence in Jamaica, for example. I should mention parenthetically that when I went to Guyana in 1979 for the first time for the Walter Rodney trial, many of the comrades from the Caribbean had come there in solidarity. And that had a very significant influence on me, being around these sophisticated, radical, and progressive forces from the Caribbean. As a matter of fact, it was at that point I began to read regularly The Economist and the Financial Times of London, which I still do today, for example, because that's what they were reading. And so the Panthers, that was a very serious political era on their part. But once again, it was not just their political era. I mean, you'd be surprised at the extent of Maoism in the US left at that particular historical moment.
Right, and we have to also pair it with your analyses of the NAACP, which you've mentioned, turning its back on the internationalist, sort of consistent internationalist project of Robison, Du Bois, and so on, to really get a full picture of this misstep. I've just a couple more questions if you've got time.
Oh, sure.
Oh, good. Speaking again on internationalism of a different variety, the Free Angela campaign had this international sort of and you've written books about Scottsboro Nine, as mentioned, William Patterson, Angelo Herndon, and Ben Davis, and Du Bois, and so on. And curious to hear if you know how you picture that sort of internationalism that budded in support of Angela Davis. What's the relationship between that variety in the 1970s and the kind of older internationalism of the Communist Party before the Smith Act trials and before the shakeup of the party in the 50s?
Well, I think there's a direct connection. I mean, actually going back before the Communist Party, of course, internationalism was a saving grace for the enslaved population. The alliance with British abolitionists was significant and profound. For example, the alliance with Mexican revolutionaries, the alliance with Black Nationalist Alliance with pre-1945 Tokyo. And then, of course, the Communist International, headquartered in Moscow, which is in existence from roughly the onset of the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, to the 1940s. Although even after the dissolution of the Communist International, there was, and actually still is, a sort of loose network of communist parties. And oftentimes, even though the Panthers had turned against the communists, if they were seeking succor in Switzerland, for example, as I point out with regard to Kathleen Cleaver, she was consulting with comrades of the U.S. Communist Party who were in Geneva, for example. And so there was this worldwide network that Angela Davis could take advantage of. Communist Party of France, Communist Party of Italy. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of Italy was contending for state power. As I've mentioned more than once, a turning point in that regard comes in 1978 when centrist Prime Minister Aldo Moro is assassinated as he's on the verge of executing the historic compromise to bring the Communist Party of Italy into government. There have been a number of interesting films about that, dramatizations, I should say. So this helps to rescue Angela Davis, just like it helps to rescue Scottsboro 9. And it becomes difficult for the Panthers to take advantage of this international network because they had sought to burn bridges that led them to the U.S. Communist Party, that led them to Moscow, etc. I mentioned that during the trial of Panther defendants in Los Angeles, post the attack on their headquarters in December 1969, but there was hardly a movement. Unlike the Angela Davis case, where there was a substantial movement, buoyed and propelled by this loose network of communist parties. And this loose network still exists to a certain degree. As one who tries to keep track of this sort of thing, now with China in the crosshairs, U.S. imperialism stepping up its attempt to undermine the Chinese Communist Party. There's this new neoconservative who has this new book called We Win, You Lose. It's about the new Cold War against China. Very blunt, I must say.
Blunt and presumptuous title.
We win, you lose. So now China is sort of integrating itself back into this network. Not a moment too soon, I might add. Which, let me speak in a jocular fashion to suggest that that may be good news for some of my books, but not others. It won't be good news for my book on Southern Africa, where I'm critical of China. Mm-hmm. Perhaps not this book either, because I'm critical of China. But for my books on slavery, I think, the Haitian Revolution, I think that they're made to order for the Chinese market.
Just need to get a good Chinese translator on that project.
Exactly. Exactly. So it was a fatal departure when the Panthers went off in this Maoist direction. But again, it was not just them. There was something in the air that was leading people in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, no, that's very, very enlightening. You do cite Joy James's contextualizing Angela Davis in this book a couple times, and she has a kind of reappraisal of the Free Angela movement and Angela Davis's persona and so on. Curious if you have any thoughts after conducting this research with regard to that recent text.
Well, I'm a big fan of the body of work that Joy James has produced in recent decades. I'm a big fan of her personally. But I'll just say briefly that some of her arguments in her book diverge from some of the arguments I put forward in my book.
Okay, yeah, we can leave that aside. So I guess maybe just a closing question. At the end of the book, you talk about the sort of legacy of the Panthers and the Communist Party embedded in the Southlands and embedded in Los Angeles and the labor movement in 2023. I think you term it the cockpit of labor militancy, or you're
Hmm.
citing someone else who's
Hmm.
uh, dubbed it as such. Can you talk a little bit about the legacy of the Panthers and the Communist Party and this variety of internationalism that you've been describing, but also this labor militancy that is still with us in full force today?
Well, sure. I mean, you see it in the Amazon Labor Union, for example. You see it once again in the Southland in terms of the militancy of Hollywood unions, for example, who have a long and glorious history of militancy, and inevitably will be in the vanguard as we confront this new era of artificial intelligence, which has significant import for Hollywood, although I dare say it has significant import for many industries in the United States of America. You see it with regard to the militancy of the hotel workers uh, in Los Angeles, the teachers union in Los Angeles. We could have dealt with some of that militancy in past decades when the auto manufacturing sector was being downsized, when the aircraft manufacturing sector was being downsized, for example, because at one time, Los Angeles, in many ways, was a captain of proletarianized industries, for example. So, as ever, I'm trying to end this book on an optimistic note. Um, the legacy of the Panthers is still with us in terms of Black militancy, for example. Obviously, the Communist Party is still with us. And in terms of publications in particular. So I'm trying to leave the reader with a sense of optimism in these dark and dank times that we are now facing.
That's a good note to remind our viewers and listeners to buy the book, read the book, so you can see this optimistic ending that Dr. Horne has crafted for its reader. Well, thank you, Dr. Horne, for talking about this 700-page book of yours, which is excellent, extraordinary research, archival, and you cite some very recent work by scholars like Drew McKivitt on the
Mm-hmm.
counterculture and the Red Scare years,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Malcolm Harris's Palo Alto book,
Mm-hmm.
Nicola Serto's Stalin book, and so on and so forth. So it's up on the latest scholarship and this deep dive into archival research, and it's a joy to read. Um, I guess we typically close by you just describing a little bit. You were just in the UK doing research.
Yeah.
You want to fill us in a little bit of what you're working on and what we can expect?
Yeah. So I was working on a number of projects. The most immediate one will be my next book, which deals with slavery in Washington, D.C. And so I was looking at the record, the Colonial Marines, the Carolina Corps, which were these disaffected Black Americans recruited by Britain to fight against the United States, particularly during the War of 1812. I was looking at records of Liberia, which may lead me to another project. Liberia being the state formed about 200 years ago by both Black Americans and those who wanted to expel free Black Americans. And I must say, before London, I had a very negative evaluation of Liberia as sort of a neo-colonial appendage. And then I read their Declaration of Independence, which is quite militant, which then leads me to wonder what else I've missed about Liberia, for example. And of course, as an independent state, they had diplomats in London who were then reaching out to Haitian diplomats, reaching out to European diplomats to put pressure on the United States. That'll probably be one of the threads that I'll pursue if I can find any documentation about it. And then I was looking at records concerning another book concerning the roots of U.S. imperialism in Hawaii and the Philippines and the Pacific into the 19th century, 20th century. And then another book dealing with North Africa. The fact that in Algiers, for example, in the beginning of the 19th century, they're enslaving Euro-Americans, for example. And then the US administration has to try to pay ransom to free them. But that was not necessarily causing the Euro-American elite to reconsider their own enslavement project of Africans. And so this North Africa project, that's probably my 2027 book. Obviously, I'm being optimistic, assuming that I'll still be around then. Whereas the Hawaii, Philippines book is my 2026 book.
You should maybe say whether any of us will be around then.
Hey, right. And then the DC book is my 2025 book.
Excellent. We look forward to all of the above. Just as a note, I think that Fox guy, Brian Kilmeade, wrote a book on the...
Right. Yeah, look. Yeah, it was a big deal. I mean, this enslavement, this capture of Euro-Americans in Algiers, in particular, making it ironic that the Panthers, a few hundred years later, set up their legation,
right,
precisely in Algiers.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure your book will be very different than Kilmeade's book, but anyway.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Right. Have you been to the baseball archives yet? Just curious.
No, I have not. I was supposed to go this summer, but this London trip really diverted me.
Gotcha.
So I haven't been able. Maybe next year.
Okay. I just was wondering because I saw that they recently folded in the Negro League baseball stats with the major.
Yeah, that was very interesting.
Yeah, that might be you probably write about that in the introduction or something. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. Always love talking to you. I guess to our listeners and viewers, Dr. Horne and I have a text coming out within days from Peace, Land, and Bread, a response to the New Republic's issue on fascism. So take a look, look out for that. I'll link it to this video should it be published before this is up on YouTube.
Yeah, send me the link whenever it goes up.
Absolutely, will do.